Hello, everyone. Our presentation today is titled Separation of Powers, and our emphasis in this presentation is to find out what are the various organs of government, the various arms of government, and how do these arms of government differ from one another. What is the nature of power in these various arms, and how is power separated? It follows actually from the previous um, presentation we had about the structure and the organization of government. All right. Now, separation of power implies basically that the three arms of government, being the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, are administered by different groups of individuals. So you don't have the same group of people in more than one of these organs of government. Right? It says that none of the organs of government should have a control over the other or to over any of the others. So the executive should not have a control over the judiciary. Judiciary should not have a control over the legislature. Each of them should function independently of one another. Um, in order to preserve the liberty of people, individuals, it's important that this principle of separating powers is practiced in every state, because this principle, to a very large extent, helps to guarantee the liberty of the individuals within such a state. All right. Now, in defining separation of powers, like many other social science concepts, there's usually not a single definition that sums up what these concepts mean. And so you find out that there are so many definitions of the principle of separating powers, right? But it's important to note that all of these definitions that exist, you know, um, point towards one direction. And Chaturvedi, Chaturvedi in 2006, provided a definition that we can work with in trying to understand the principle of separating powers. Separation of powers, according to Chaturvedi, is described as a function of government performed by these three organs of government we've mentioned: the legislature, the executive, and judiciary. Where each of these organs is limited to its own sphere of action. So, every of all the organs of government have their own job functions, their own job roles. They have a task that they ought to perform, and they're doing it independently and supreme. Within that action. So, in the legislature, for instance, legislature is supposed to make laws, right? Within that organ, within that sphere of lawmaking, the legislature should be independent, should be able to discharge their functions without any kind of interference from any other organ of government. That's what Chaturvedi is saying. All right, and that's essentially the understanding around the concept or the principle of separation of powers. All right, without this principle, it is obvious that any organ of government can perform the function of any other organ of government without recourse to the fact that that is not their job function. And of course, this is a recipe for disaster. This is the beginning of chaos and injustice. So basically, separation of power means, or it can be defined or understood in the context of all the three organs of government performing their functions independently, and supreme um, within those action of or within those areas of influence that they have to function. Now, how did this principle originate? Baron de Montesquieu is a French writer, um, a French writer and a French scholar. Is credited as having coined the term separation of powers. All right, but the question is, did Baron de Montesquieu the first individual to refer to this notion in practice? Was there a practice of separation of powers before Montesquieu? Perhaps that wasn't known as separation of powers. Maybe Montesquieu um, gave it that name, but was there some form of practice of separating powers before Montesquieu came up with this concept? And the answer is yes. In fact, it is believed that in practice, separating powers, dates back to the Grecian city-states, where powers, was separated among um, the various branches of government in those ancient Greek city-states. And this also went down to the Roman Republic. Of course, after the Grecian Empire fell, or after the Grecian Empire, um, um, you know, um, not necessarily fell, but lost its power, lost its supremacy. The Roman Republic took over, and of course, the Roman Republic is known for marrying, church and state. Of course, it began as a church system, and then it grew to a state system. Where ancient European states were born out of. All right. So even in the Roman Republic, you still saw that power was separated among organs of government. And it even went as far as separating powers between the church and the state. So in the Roman Republic, the church, had its own function, and it was supposed to be independent from the state, which is also a principle that many modern states practice. The religious system is expected to be neutral and separate from the political system. So the principle of separating powers, did not begin with Montesquieu. The principle had been on for several centuries before, until Montesquieu perhaps gave it that name. Even as early as 1690, John Locke referred to that same principle in his book, the Treatise of Government, or Treatise on Government rather. That was the book written by John Locke in 1690. And in that book, he referred to the fact that you know the legislature and the executive arms of government are different conceptually, and of course they should also be practically different and separate. But one critique, one challenge of John Locke's argument was the fact that the judiciary was not given any significant role in society, or in human interactions. All right, which of course Montesquieu brought in when he wrote his own book, The Spirit of Laws, in 1748. So Montesquieu provided what we could call a more robust, a more contemporary understanding to the concept of separation of power, the principle of separation of powers. And it says that there's no liberty if the judicial powers are not separate from the legislature and the executive. So Montesquieu brought in what was missing in John Locke's argument, brought in the role of the judiciary, and of course emphasized that the fact that judiciary must also be, an integral part of the state and must be separate, independent from the other organs of government. Other scholars also um, emphasized emphasized the separation of powers and the fact that these this principle helps to eliminate, tendencies of dictatorship, tendencies of authoritarianism, authoritarian rule, you know, um, and so Montesquieu, John Locke are not the only ones who have who have dealt with this notion, with this principle. Other scholars have also lent their ideas. So, from what we have said, it is obvious that separation of powers, is similar with the principle or with the doctrine of checks and balances, and we'll go into that in a moment. But let us see now what is the modern understanding of separation of powers. So, in a brief summary, what we're saying is that the principle of separation of powers, can be understood as follows. Number one is that the organs of government, the legislature, the executive, judiciary, must not interfere with one another. Their functions must be independent, must be separate, and they must have the the um, the freedom to operate within the sphere of influence, that they have been assigned to, the functions they have been assigned to do. The second is that judges must be independent. Judges must not be stooges of the executive officers or legislative officers. The judiciary must be independent of these other two organs of government, and of course, those organs must be independent of one another as well. Number three is that the same individuals, of course, should not hold posts in more than one of these three branches, and one branch of government should not exercise the function of another. So these, are four ways in which we can succinctly summarize the the principle of separation of power. We can briefly summarize. So understanding these four key bullets is crucial in understanding what separation of power means. All right. Now let's talk about the similarities between separation of power as a principle and the doctrine of checks and balances. You find out that the both of them seem to share some similar attributes, and some of these attributes are the fact that they both discourage interference and overlap of functions within the organs of government. They emphasize that each organ should be independent, should be neutral, should be free to operate within its own sphere of influence. They also de-emphasize the exercise of absolute power, right? Because absolute political power is said to corrupt absolutely, and so power has to be checked. Power has to be exercised in the context of the rules that exist. So both separation of power and checks and balances as principles and doctrines in political science, help to emphasize the fact that power must not be exercised in excess. All right. They also provide opportunities whereby government officials can be held responsible for their actions and inactions. You know, they allow for investigation and removal of corrupt, incompetent public officers. You know, and public from public office. So when you find out that public officers are incompetent and corrupt, you know, um, there are mechanisms within this principle of checks and or principle of separation of power. Within the doctrine of checks and balances, there are mechanisms get these to get these officers out of the public office. All right, and finally, they help to encourage and allow for more effective management of the resources of the state, as well as the instrument of power. So you find out that checks and balances as a doctrine, as well as separation of power, share as they are more or less, they more or less drive towards the same objective, which is to ensure that power is exercised within the context of the rules of regulations that exist within the state, to ensure that individuals are not arbitrary, are not supreme to the state or to the rest of the other people within society. Now, how can we perceive separation of power in Nigeria? How do we perceive separation of power in Nigeria? The Nigerian Constitution, the 1999 Constitution of Nigeria, spells out the powers of the three arms of government, you know, and you can find that in so many of the sections and subsections of the Constitution. Some of them that we have listed here are section 231, where it is highlighted the process of the role of the executive in appointing the chief justice, in appointing judges to the Supreme Court, you know, and how the fact that the executive is just recommends these individuals who are, or appoints rather, these individuals who are recommended by the National Judicial Council, and of course, such appointment by the executive has to be ratified by the legislature. So that is, you can find in section 231. Section 4 also emphasizes the fact that um, the legislature cannot make laws that are not within the laws already made by the judiciary. So the judiciary, the constitution already has rules that govern the state. So the legislature cannot make laws um, that are in conflict with the laws of the constitution. Basically, every law that's made by the legislature, every policy, every act must be in line with every bill that is passed, must be in line with the laws, that regulate the land, the constitution of the republic. Section 58, subsection 3 and 4 talks about the process of passing a bill. You know, the fact that the president has to assent, and he cannot just indefinitely hold the bill without either saying, he's assenting or rejecting, withdrawing his assent. So it is clear that the Constitution prescribes what functions each organ of government performs and how they ought to perform those functions as well. You see, so which is the ideal thing. But whether or not um, separation of power is ideally practiced in Nigeria is something that we can also that also begs for argument. You know, and the argument we cannot exhaust in this presentation. But the point is that the constitution of every modern democracy must spell out in clear detail the functions that each organ of government should perform. That way, it is easier for every organ of government to understand their functions and to stick within those functions, and not interfere or meddle into the affairs of other organs of government. Now, in conclusion, um, separation of power as a principle, in theory, is what we have just explained. But the practice of separation of power, if it is strictly practiced, it is obvious that the government function will be paralyzed, because the state cannot function effectively without some form of relationship among these three organs of government. We talked about legislative executive relations, while talking about the organs, the structure of government. So there has to be some kind of synergy, has to be some kind of cooperation, some kind of relationship among the various organs of government, including the judiciary. Even though the judiciary is expected to be independent, it's expected to be neutral, but of course, the judiciary also, you know, must synergize, must be in cooperation, must be in alliance. Not necessarily alliance, but must be, you know, must not be it must not antagonize. It must not antagonize, the rest of the state. So strict practice of separation of power, in very many cases, appear impossible, because that would mean that the state simply cannot function. All right. However, we must not. That doesn't mean that separating powers, you know, should not be something that every state strives or endeavors for or strives towards. Because, like we have seen, separation of powers emphasizes the adoption of structures and processes that help to safeguard the future, safeguard liberty in the present and even in the future. So if we must ensure that liberty, you know, that we improve on the nature of liberty we enjoy in the present, and of course secure liberty for future generations, then separation of power is a principle that must be pursued, that must be encouraged. You know, it also helps to limit the fact that leaders become ambitious, leaders become self-serving, and the behavior of the self-centered, self-maximizing behavior of leaders is also reduced, is limited, so that leaders can contribute their efforts into the furtherance and development of the state society, and not abuse power, that has been entrusted to them by the people. All right. So, in summary, separation of power helps to monitor political systems, helps to promote and protect liberty, helps to advocate for measures that can be used to manage or combat, you know, or prevent any threat to liberty. All right, prevent any threat to liberty. Um, so basically, the point that is being made is that the separation of power is a principle that is very, very key to any democracy. It's very, very key to any democracy. And of course, it must be practiced within the context of every state. States are unique. The United States of America is an entirely different democracy compared to Nigeria. A different history, different groups of individuals, you know, different customs. So all of these must be put into cognizance in implementing and practicing um, the principle of separation of powers. You know, so that is the much that will be said in this presentation. We have talked about the fact that separation of power is a very important principle that helps to ensure that power is separated among the three organs of government, and that these three organs are independent and are free, to operate within their sphere of actions or the sphere of influence. And the fact that this is a very important principle to help safeguard the liberty of the people, to help manage government resources more efficiently, to help avoid and limit the possibility of abuse of power, and several other things that we have mentioned. We're going to stop at this point in this presentation. And if you have questions, if you have comments, we can take those after now. Thank you very much for your attention.